I worry because I asked.
No, but don't, I think you just gotta let it go.
Fun. Yeah.
You have fun.
All right, let's do it.
Cool, let's go.
Yeah. So Scott, it's so awesome to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, me too. So tell me about Fuelin and what you do, just so my listeners can kind of dial in too.
Yeah, so Fuelin is a nutrition program that is an iOS app, and what it allows is particularly Ironman and triathlete athletes to really dial in their day-to-day nutrition, so that not only can they be, racing their best race, but also really dial in their overall health.
Awesome. And what inspired you to start this app and platform?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing, it all started back in 2017 when I started working with a female professional athlete by the name of Sarah Piano. Okay. She was a high-performing professional triathlete at the time, but also had a number of health issues, which she's been very, open with in terms of in social media and things like that, with Hashimoto's and some thyroid issues. As well as a lot of gut-related issues. So we were introduced to each other, and she was under the guise of Matt Dixon from Purple Patch.
Okay, Purple Patch, yeah.
Yeah, training, and based in California. So we started working together and went about sort of, not just looking at her race performance, but really dialing in what was happening with her overall health. So we did a lot of testing in terms of blood testing. She did metabolic cart. We did some gut testing through metabolomics, and went about changing her diet on a day-to-day basis. And then what I realized is that they were using today's plan at that point in time. So today's plan is similar to Training Peaks in the way the coach sort of puts it out. So what I started doing with Google Sheets was sort of mirroring their training plan. So I could see she had a training session in the morning and then one in the afternoon. So I was then building all her meals or feeds, as we would talk about them, before, during, and after every session. And we would periodize that based on carbohydrate amounts. So the theory was, and it sort of relates to a seminal paper by James Morton and Sam Impey, which was titled "The Fuel for the Work Required," which you're probably quite familiar with, and probably a lot of your listeners are. And what this talks about is the notion that I think carbohydrates are demonized pretty much. Or they have been demonized.
We're going to talk about carbohydrates.
Yeah. And so what this paper did was say, carbohydrates are an essential macronutrient, and especially one for endurance athletes. And when used appropriately based on duration and intensity of exercise, they can be extremely useful in creating not just obviously high performance, but improving metabolic flexibility and improving, markers where that might be things like body composition or potentially health markers such as blood markers as well.
Oh, okay. So I thought you were going to keep talking.
No, I'll give you an opportunity to talk.
Oh, thank you. So, I think that is, such an awesome tool to be able to have as an athlete. And I feel like, how important is it to be just so dialed in to your training, but also to your nutrition around your training, and having something like Fuelin. I love that you had it originally in Google Sheets, because that's something I would do. I mean, I've done things like that where I know in Training Peaks you can map out your entire training program for the year, but I like to see it a different way visually. So I've done it in Excel. But yeah, I mean, I definitely get that necessity for the nutrition. So like, how important is it to be dialed in?
Well, I think what we saw with someone like Sarah, so, previously, prior to that, I mean, it's very funny, like she always tells the story, she'd seen some celebrity nutritionist in LA and was effectively told to eat, a pound, 2 pounds of meat in the evening, so about 1 kilo of meat in the evening, and that was her predominant protein source for the day. She was eating very low amounts of carbohydrates and very low amounts of fat. Her overall nutrition just wasn't in line with what her training was. And ultimately she was getting pretty sick as a result.
Right.
So when you go back, when I use her as an example, what we started doing was effectively just providing meals and the composition of those meals was appropriate to what the training was, i.e. if it was low intensity, long duration, you would use lower amounts of carbohydrates, lower glycemic index type foods, potentially use a little bit more fat and fuel that session appropriately. But when it came to higher intensity, sessions of a significant duration, if you're doing 60-minute sessions, even if they are Z3, Z4, Z5, you don't need to be fueling that in session with a lot of carbohydrates.
Right.
But when you get past sort of, that 80, 90 minute and you need to continue going, then and if you're working at a certain intensity, i.e. more than 65% of your VO2 max, then you're going to require carbohydrates to continue fueling that session if your goal is to perform really well in that session. And I think that's
right.
The take-home point is it depends on what the purpose of the session is. And so when we look at Fuelin, what we're doing, and we've gone beyond Google Sheets obviously now. We have an iOS app that syncs directly with the athlete's training peaks, today's plan, and final surge. And so what the athlete now gets is an actual nutrition program that is actually tailored to what their coach is delivering in their training plan. And that, for me, that's very, very unique in that,
it's absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I think it is like the best idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
The other products that are out there, they're not designed for this. Like, this is such a unique concept. Really. I mean, even Map My Fitness, like I enter things in there, and I know that you are connected with like people who use Map. Is it Map My Fitness, or what is the?
No, we also sync with MyFitnessPal. And with Lose It. Yeah. So, your macronutrients are obviously, we give out your daily macros from a protein, a fat, a carbohydrate, total caloric requirement, plus all the in-session fueling and what sort of targets you should be hitting with prescription of types of foods that you should be using, or supplements, especially for higher intensity sessions. But the Fuelin app will sync with MyFitnessPal, with Lose It. And so it nearly becomes a little bit of a game where, you're trying to knock off the target of calories or macronutrients within the day. And selecting, even within the app, we've got, I think, over 750 different recipes, which are all, again, color-coded so that red is lower. And we don't talk about low carbohydrate. Low, the definition of low carbohydrate is probably less than 50 grams of carbohydrate an entire day. We talk about lower grams of carbohydrate, i.e. in a meal, that would be around 30 grams of carbohydrates. And if we're talking about across an entire day, it's probably less than around 3.2 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrate, which, again, for the listeners, they're probably like, oh God, there's a lot of math coming in. And it's like, I get it. And I was just writing an article for Triathlete magazine, and it's based around a 12-week sort of nutrition program for someone doing a build towards a long course, so 70.3 or an Ironman. And I start to write this article, and I'm like, you start putting in mathematical equations and how to do it, and factoring in week on week hours of training, intensity, if the purpose is to lose weight in the first 6 weeks and so on. And you can see why so many athletes get confused, because there is so much background calculations and thought that goes into it.
Well, and there's so and as an athlete, there's so many different sort of approaches and strategies and things that you hear are right or wrong, exactly what you're saying. And then just being in the regular world, right? Like not being an athlete, but listening to just general diets, like whatever the popular diet is of the season, right? Like it's all like so much information, it's so confusing. And I always say, whenever anyone asks me, and even for me, like you have to really know yourself and do what works for you. So, I personally, and I'm always like biohacking my nutrition because, it changes. It's not like 2 years ago, I was doing two completely different things for my diet and for specifically, every day versus training. And now I have to rethink it because the 2 years that we were off, I wasn't, I wasn't in that like race zone as frequently as I would have been. I added some very bad foods to my diet, like everyone did during the pandemic. It is what it is, but you have to like do you, and understanding how your body works is, as an athlete, we have this advantage because we're constantly on, training peaks or today's plan and looking at our heart rates and our, all of the metrics that, we look at to get better. But I think, nutrition is the fourth sport, and it's really awesome to be able to be so dialed in to your nutrition. And carbohydrates, we're going to talk about them.
Well, we're talking about carbs, and we're talking about, like, let's touch on what you said there. Like, I think so many athletes we see come onto the program, they've done all these fancy diets, they've tried this, they've tried that. And if you actually come down to the basics of science, then, if you're trying to lose weight, you have to be in a caloric deficit. Now, why did the diet work that you went on? Like, you'll speak to people and they're like, oh, I was on a high fat, low carb diet. Why did it lose weight? Why did they lose weight? Because they were in a caloric deficit. They went on carnivore diet. Why did you lose weight? Because you're in a caloric deficit. I went on a paleo diet. Why did you lose weight? Because you're in a caloric deficit. It doesn't matter what the diet type is, as you said, whatever works for you. But the overarching theme of those diets is you have to be in a caloric deficit in order to lose body fat or lose body weight. So if we then go full circle and then come back to, okay, let's look at health and let's look at performance. You can periodize your caloric intake, usually through manipulation of carbohydrates is probably the easiest way. Manipulating fat is also another way. Keeping protein probably fairly steady based on your total body mass.
Right.
And then it becomes a little bit easier to manage because it's not like one food is demonized. Oh, I can actually eat rice, I can eat pasta, or I can eat bread, but I've just got to understand the proportions of that and understand what my portion size is relative to my body size in order to achieve the goal I'm trying to do. And if your goal, as I say, is if your goal is weight loss or fat loss and improving body composition, then we need to just manage the total caloric intake across the course of a day, a week, a month in relation to your exercise. And that's exactly what Fuelin does.
And so how does that work? Because I mean, if you are training for an Ironman, you're doing 2 days, so you kind of need to eat more, but there's like a fine line.
Well, exactly. So you don't, and I think again, like we see this all the time, is athletes trying to starve themselves in order to lose body mass and lose fat mass. Yet ultimately what that's going to have an impact on is the ability to perform exercise, which if you then can't perform your exercise and you're not moving day to day, then your total caloric expenditure is probably going to go down. So, the human body is very smart. If you don't feed it, we know that that casually, or causally, that the day's energy expenditure will likely drop because your general activity will drop because you don't have the energy. It's this energy flux whereby if you're low on energy, you're not going to move as much. If you're high on energy, you're going to move more. The body tends to manipulate and modulate what is actually going on. So if you are in a caloric deficit and you are doing exercise and you're managing to do that, you still probably need to be cognizant about just generally moving day to day, i.e. taking a lot of steps. And if you do your exercise and then you just sit on the couch every day and you end up taking, 1,000 steps in the whole day, net, you're probably not going to have enough energy expenditure. And you're probably better off just working on eating better and just moving more as a daily basis rather than going and killing yourself for 60 minutes and then doing nothing for the rest of the day.
I know. It's always, I find for me, since I'm always on this, on this sort of I feel like every day is like a race. Like I wake up, I drink coffee, I'm working, and I have to, I'm balancing, like I'm sure all of your clients, right? All of your athletes that you work with, like all of us age group athletes and pros, like we've got a lot going on. And, one of the things we think about is exercise, our daily work, if it's not exercise, and nutrition. And so, when I wake up in the morning, I will have like a cup of coffee and I'm actually not hungry. I'm not hungry, but I also need to work out. So I have to force myself to eat breakfast so that I can, have that hour window for my food to digest before I go for a run. And I can't even go for a run after an hour. I mean, this is where I'm at in my nutrition, is I'm trying to figure out like, what can I eat before I run for X amount of time? And how long do I need to wait between when I eat that thing till when I go for my run? And that's kind of like, and then I build all my meetings in between the time that I eat and the time that I can run. That's basically, and then, then it will happen is I won't work out all day and I will have eaten all this food, and then I'll have like to go to the pool, and that's even worse. So yeah, I'm starving in the pool. Then I come home, it's a cycle, it's a vicious cycle, but my goal is to be healthy and perform well. So I always feel like I have to, something happened with the video. Sorry. I always feel like I'm always thinking about that. And I'm sure your athletes think about that too, right?
Well, hopefully they don't have to think about it, because that's what we do, is we give them the program so that, in your case, like, let's talk about your morning run. Like, what is your morning run?
Right now it's really like an hour.
An hour.
It's an hour. Yeah. So I don't really need to eat anything, but
well, yes and no, because I look at you and I'm like, is your overarching goal, is it to lose body mass or lose body fat? That's a very personal question.
Yeah. No. So body mass or body fat. I'm just looking to have a good run. Like, I'm not looking to lose anything. I just want to be like strong on my run.
Perfect. So if you think about that, what's really important for you to do?
Yeah.
It's probably to eat something prior to the run. Now, you talked about needing to do that for an hour before. Well, it depends, because it depends if you're trying to train the gut and train the brain to actually be better at actually coping with having a full stomach, improve gastric emptying, improve carbohydrate absorption, whatnot, then actually eating sort of 5 to 10 minutes before that run, even if it is of high intensity, can be a useful exercise in itself, especially if you suffer from GI complaints.
I do, yeah.
For something like that, you're going for an hour run, you want to feel really good. Something as simple as a piece of toast, a crumpet, a wrap, something like that with some jam on it, or a little bit of peanut butter and a bit of jam, jelly for the Americans. That can be a perfect snack. It will give you around 20 to 30 grams of carbs. It will give you 5 to 10 grams of fat, give you a little bit of protein. Out the door, you've got energy, you've got fuel on board. We know through science that if you do a session with fuel on board, you will generally, the RPE, so the rate of perceived exertion, is going to be lower, and the ability to push out, to go faster or push out more watts, is going to be improved.
That's exactly what I've been doing. So originally I was eating oatmeal for breakfast every morning, which I think is great, but I think my body just stopped wanting to. I mean, I've eaten oatmeal, and I'm also mostly gluten-free. Let's talk about carbs, because there's all kinds of information out there. And I just time out on the podcast. Is it true? Okay. So this is what I want to know. Like, in terms of carbohydrates, I'd love to understand more about how to use them while you're racing. Like, how do you figure out the number that you should be taking in per hour based on what zone you're in and what your goals are?
Okay, so that's probably far more interesting than getting into the science of carbohydrates, because it's actually a practical strategy that, is something that we work on a lot with our athletes and we tend to focus on. So I think what is really important initially is for athletes to understand that carbohydrates are an important fuel source when you're wanting to go hard and fast. So think about it this way: if you're working more than, say, 65, 70% of your VO2 max, then, and that's going to be a percentage, people can go and get that tested either with a metabolic cut, or you can then work out, there are formulas so you can work out percentage of, say, either your lactic threshold or of your maximum heart rate. So if you're going to be, or even as an RPE, if you're working probably at a 6 or a 7 of an RPE, a rate of perceived exertion, and you need to do that continuously, as I said before, for over 80 minutes, then carbohydrates are pretty much going to be your preferred fuel source. So that's the first important point.
Right.
When you then think about how do you go about understanding the grams per hour that you need to consume, what you need to do is establish some baselines. So again, what we do within the Fuelin program is the athletes will record what the session is. Let's say it's a bike session, it's Z3, and they're going for, let's say, 120 minutes. So what they will do is then note down everything that they eat during that session. And then what you're doing is, okay, so your liquid carbohydrates, your chews or blocks, your gels, if you're going to consume a bar, fine, doing that, recording everything you're doing, and then dividing that amount of grams of carbohydrates by the duration of the session, i.e. by 2 hours in this case. Now, what that's going to give you is a grams per hour that you've managed to achieve. Now, again, a lot of athletes will come to us and say, oh, look, I consume a lot of carbohydrates, I'm very good with this. And then they do something like that as a simple test, and it actually turns out that, okay, they're consuming 32 grams per hour. And that's very low. And that's very, very low. So 32 grams, don't get me wrong here, that is a very low consumption rate. However, what you often see with athletes like that, in particular women athletes, is that they will complain of a sense of fullness, potentially nausea, burping, maybe flatulence, as a result of just taking in that amount of carbohydrates. Now, it could be that amount of carbohydrates that was causing the issues, or it could be the types of carbohydrates that they took in that could be causing the issues. So, i.e., was it liquid carbohydrate that is causing the issues? Because if you get a lot of burping, a lot of belching, a lot of sort of upper GI complaints, that can be related to gastric emptying. We know that a highly concentrated carbohydrate liquid can slow down the rate of gastric emptying from the stomach into the small intestine. So if you're complaining of those types of symptoms, then it may be that because you're using a liquid carbohydrate, that is what's causing that. If you're complaining more of potentially nausea, cramping, maybe excessive gas, things like that, then it could be something more to do with absorption, maybe going through the small intestine where you're not managing to actually absorb the carbohydrates. And that could be due to the type, again, of carbohydrate. So was it too much fructose? Was it not enough glucose? Were you taking in these multiple transportable carbohydrates, i.e. glucose and fructose, at a ratio or at a rate that wasn't required because your actual rate of consumption was very, very low. Right. So there's a lot going on there, but I guess for the athlete, what they've just got to think about is, okay, well, what was I eating? Was it liquids? Was it chews? Was it gels? Was it a bar? Did I get symptoms? Yes or no? And then go about sort of working out, okay, if I deduct or remove one of those products and consume the same rate of carbohydrates, i.e. go back and do another 32 grams, but without maybe the liquid carbohydrate, what were your symptoms like? Oh, okay, now they were better. Okay, now we're going to say, maybe we remove or reduce the amount of liquid carbohydrate that you're consuming, start to increase the use of blocks or chews or gels, and then start to increase the total amount of carbohydrates on an hourly basis. And then you start to see progress through repeated efforts of this. And that's pretty much how you start to improve your, what we term at Fuelin, the carb capacity. So your ability to take on higher amounts of carbohydrates per hour through repeated
And that's
efforts.
the goal, is to be able to take in more because it gives you more energy. But you have to kind of like workshop it and ease into it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to start somewhere. Like the gut is like a muscle. And I think like any muscle, you can train a muscle. So first time you step into the gym, you go onto the bench press, you're not going to bang out 100 kilos. Okay, that's not going to be, unless you're, again, maybe you're quite strong, but most people are going to go in there, they're probably going to load the bar up, they're going to put a 10 on each side, and that's going to feel pretty heavy. And then the second session, it gets a bit easier. Third session, they start to have more weight and so on. And it's the same analogy with training your gut, is start with an amount. You've got a baseline. Some people can take in huge amounts from word go with no issues. I personally can take in 90 grams an hour on a run with no, it's just nothing at all. Now, I'm very lucky. A lot of men, fortunately, have a higher tolerance to carbohydrates than, say, women. Women tend to get more GI issues. And we see this historically, and what we're seeing anecdotally through all the data that we capture in Fuelin is that women will generally have a lower consumption rate per hour and also grams per kilo body weight. And so it is through repeated efforts of these type of intensity, i.e. race pace or above, where of significant duration, where the athletes are being encouraged to actually practice their race day fueling in training. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you want to use carbohydrates in a race situation, you need to practice it. Simple as that. Professional athletes do this all the time.
Yeah, and you still don't even know what's going to happen on race day. I mean, at least you have a better idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, things go wrong. I think we had 16 athletes racing at Lake Placid on the weekend. All of them, have come out of it with a learning experience. Some of them, didn't maybe do as well as they wanted in terms of their GI complaints, but they all actually posted PRs. So
that's great.
Whilst they didn't necessarily have the best race of their life, because they, I guess somewhere along the line, everyone thinks they're going to have the perfect race. The perfect race probably doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a whole other, I mean.
Look at Blumenfeld on the weekend at the PTO.
Yeah.
Like he cramped and still came second. I mean, well, I think he had a cramp, but things are going to go wrong in a race.
Like going all out for the entire race until the last few miles. I mean, that's a whole other strategy. I love his enthusiasm and his I'm going to go for it. He's so young, it doesn't matter.
Well, exactly. When you're young, things are easier, aren't they? But I mean, I think it comes down to what's going to happen in the race is going to be dictated by what you did in training. Now, if you go into training and understand what types of products you can use and get your consumption rate up. Now, as a minimum, what we're pushing athletes to get to is an absolute minimum 60 grams an hour. Okay. Now, obviously, depending on your pace, how fast you want to go in the race, what your athletic ability is, obviously your ability to tolerate carbohydrates, that may be as high as you need to go. But then for the athletes, the age groupers, the pros who want to ultimately go faster and faster, then, 90 grams an hour is sort of your new benchmark. And then beyond that, we know that if you can set yourself up on the bike and get up, for women aiming around 100, 120 grams an hour, and for the men certainly getting up to 120 grams an hour on the bike, that is going to set you up on the run. Because we know that taking on these exogenous carbohydrates, these, external carbohydrates and consuming them is going to help with keeping blood sugar stable. It's going to offset.
Are they stored? When you eat everything on the bike, is it all stored for the run, or you burn through it on the bike?
No, you're using it. You're using it. And that's the point. We know that the oxidation rate of these carbohydrates is quite high. And so you're getting through this exogenous carbohydrates, potentially sparing. Now, again, it's not going to completely spare the stored glycogen. So there's glycogen in the muscle and the liver, but it is going to offset the use of that, at least to delay the use of it or minimize the use of it, so that when you are getting off the bike, you're coming into the run feeling actually pretty good. And then depending if it's a 70.3 or an Ironman, you could probably look to drop down the rate of carbohydrate intake on the run, maybe to around 50, anywhere between 40 and 60 grams an hour, and still go really, really fast. On an Ironman, you're probably still going to be wanting to consume fairly high rates of carbohydrate because of the duration of it and because of the pace. But the overarching theme here is that if you can set yourself up on the bike by taking in large amounts of carbohydrates, your run is going to be significantly better. And again, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that in the research. Well, we're not seeing it in the research so much because actually we don't have a lot of data on triathletes in terms of looking at high consumption on the run, on the bike going into the runoff. But we're certainly seeing it in the clinical sense with all our athletes where they're reporting, wow, I actually felt amazing getting off the bike and actually had power in my legs and could go at the pace that they desired to go at.
So carbohydrates are really sort of the secret to success when it comes to performance in triathlon and running as well.
Yeah, I mean, look.
One of the secrets.
Yeah, I mean, again, like if you're talking about the race on race day, certainly if you want to go fast and you're looking to perform at your absolute best, then I would be strongly urging an athlete to consider using carbohydrates as their primary fuel source, as opposed to one of the other macronutrients, i.e. protein or fat. If you want to eat fat on a race day, just be prepared that you're probably not going to go as fast as someone on carbohydrates.
Well, that was, something that everybody was talking about. I don't know if it was last year or, being on like this mission to burn fat and use fat as fuel during racing. Like, what happened to that concept? I mean, is that even like, do people still do that? To me, that sounded crazy, but yeah.
No, I mean, it's all, this notion of metabolic flexibility, whereby you can increase your ability to use your endogenous fat source, so the fat on your body, as a fuel source at a intensity. You can push that intensity to the right, i.e. you can work at a slightly higher intensity and improve the maximum amount of fat that you can burn as an athlete at that given intensity. Now, that's done through training by not necessarily smashing high amounts of carbohydrates in lower intensity sessions of significant duration. And that's the point when a coach gives you these long, low intensity bike rides or low intensity runs, whereby you're not going to be smashing huge amounts of high glycemic type carbohydrates, i.e. gels, blocks, liquids in those, and potentially using smaller amounts of carbohydrates, but certainly higher amounts of fat. And that's how you go about improving metabolic flexibility. And it's probably overarching is it's the long duration type sessions at low intensity that helps with that, regardless even of what you're eating. It's just time spent doing it at low intensity. But so that will help your ability to use fat as a fuel source in the race. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about using exogenous carbohydrates to fuel high performance. And you've got to remember as a listener that, or as an athlete, that it's not like there's a switch and you suddenly go, oh, now I'm using carbohydrates. Like you start off in the race, you're probably going to be using some form of, mixed macronutrients from the body and taking it in. But then as we get through, like beyond 3 hours, the rate of fat oxidation and the rate of carbohydrate oxidation goes through the roof. It doesn't matter what you're eating, your body is using everything it can at this point in time.
Right.
And so and that's a really important point as well, once you go beyond 3 hours, your body is burning fat as well.
Yeah. And so how does breakfast fit into that equation, and like what you eat on race day, and how far in advance, and how do those calories play into the rest of your day and your strategy?
On race day?
Yeah, let's start with race day.
So, I mean, you talked about oatmeal before, in your scenario before where you were saying you were going out for an hour run, I would certainly, depending on your total calories that you require, but oatmeal or overnight oats. So oats with some protein in it, whether it's a whey protein or a plant protein mixed in with that, combined with some nuts and seeds and your oatmeal, perfect post-run meal. Like that's a really good post-run meal. I probably wouldn't recommend you going and eating that before going and doing a high intensity run at that point in time.
Yeah.
However, on race day, you've got to remember that you're probably consuming this meal 2 hours, hopefully 2 hours, at least 90 minutes before the start of the race. Now, again, let's think long course, 70.3 or an Ironman, you're going to be out there for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Like
best
at least
case,
5 hours.
yeah,
Yeah.
good,
I mean,
good
that's
case
for the
for a 70.3. Yeah. 5 hours would be fantastic. You know,
or 6 hours.
average age grouper, you're probably talking, 6+ hours. So why wouldn't you eat a large breakfast in the morning, which is going to sustain you with some energy? So we're talking carbohydrates, fats, and protein at that point in time, because you're going to your rate of digestion is going to be sufficient to allow you to eat that. Now, again, I wouldn't say go and eat a large protein oats with, fruit salad, some toast, everything like that. Take in 120, 140 grams of carbs, maybe 30 grams of protein, 30 grams of fat. If on race day, if you haven't practiced it in training,
right.
Again, think about what you're trying to do here. You spend so much time swimming, biking, running, all that training, and then you go and sabotage it by trying something that you've never done before on race day, i.e. eat a large meal that you've never practiced before going and doing a really long brick. So again, what we emphasize in our program is practice what you're going to do on race day, i.e. understand exactly what you're going to eat on race day. And certainly go-to meal would be something like protein oats with, banana, some fruit salad, a couple of bits of toast, jam, peanut butter, probably a coffee because it's 4 a.m. or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you're going to be, as long as you practice that, and depending on your body size, and I'm giving rough amounts there, but you're probably aiming for around, hopefully 2 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates as a minimum, along with potentially 30, 40 grams of protein and 30 odd grams of fat, just to get total calories into the body, because you're going to be expending a lot of calories when it comes to this day.
And you expend calories even when you're not doing anything. So it's like, if you are eating breakfast at 4 a.m, like while you're, on your way to the race, you're not getting in the water till 6:37. So that's like 3 hours. And when you're swimming, I mean, the food's already probably digested. So you're already like,
Well, it's being digested, it's going to sit, it's going to be in there.
In your stomach for 5 hours. Yeah.
I mean, the other point is, we're talking about taking in some fiber in the morning of the race, and the days leading into the race, you would be, aiming to reduce.
That was my next question.
Yeah. So
how do you
aiming,
prepare the days before the race? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So you're aiming to reduce total fiber intake, potentially reduce intake of FODMAPs being carbohydrates that are known. How do I explain this in simple terms? So FODMAP stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, and polyols. These are types of carbohydrates which confer a lot of health benefits through being generally insoluble or soluble fibers that the gut microbiome feed on to produce short chain fatty acids, which ultimately fuel a lot of the physiological processes that go on in the human body. Now, whilst they are very important for overall health in the human body, they also are known irritants, and the fermentation of these, which will occur in the large intestine, generally can cause things like burping, flatulence, bloating, all the signs and symptoms where people say, oh, I'm very sensitive, or I've got potentially a sensitivity or an intolerance to something. Now, some of those symptoms are normal symptoms because of the fermentation process, but there are some types of FODMAPs that ultimately can be known irritants, and by reducing those in day-to-day nutrition, that can obviously be a big help to an athlete or an individual who does suffer from, say, GI distress on a day-to-day basis. So those FODMAPs in particular, things like, garlic, onion in particular, are known FODMAPs that cause irritation. You want to start to reduce those total fiber 36, 48 hours leading into a race, because what you're trying to do is reduce total fecal matter inside your body. You're trying to reduce the amount of, ultimately the amount of shit within you, because
so that you don't have it in you.
Exactly. But then on the morning of race day, you actually want to take in some fiber, because we know that fiber and carbohydrates in particular are protective of the gut lining when we talk about heat stress injury, which is most likely going to occur during long duration, high intensity, hot environmental exercise. So there is,
I mean, that's really important
points
to think about, like the days leading into the race.
Yeah, and you know what you are consuming on the bike and what you've consumed in the days leading up, what you consumed in the morning. You know, could you evacuate in the morning to put it nicely? Like, you know, were you able to do that? And were you able? I
could never talk about this stuff until I was like an athlete. By the way, like this conversation would never happen pre-athlete. I'm in an athlete zone. Like,
again, like, you know, look at again, if you get a lot of issues with the run off the bike, which is the most common complaint. And the reason for that is because of the mechanical stress applied, as opposed to on the bike where you're in a very stable position. Ask yourself, how often do you practice the fueling on the bike and then fueling with the run off the bike? Because if we look at the majority of what athletes do, and this is, again, I'm not saying every coach does this, I'm just saying we see it, and it's something that we work with a lot of the coaches on, is let's put in some decent run off the bike in conjunction with a decent bike leg in training to see actually what happens. Then if you start doing these 90-90s, I tend to refer to them as 90-90s, 90 minutes on the bike as opposed to 3 hours on the bike. But instead of a 20-minute run off the bike, why don't you push that out to 60 minutes or 90 minutes and actually practice high carbohydrate fueling on the bike and go into high carbohydrate fueling on the run, i.e. the way you're going to do it in a race, and see what starts to happen. And if you start to do that, you might be pleasantly surprised that first time you do it, probably feels terrible and you'll get a lot of GI complaints. You'll probably need to go to the toilet and so on. But then as we go back to what I said, you start to work out what products can fuel you very well on the bike, but also serve you really well on the run. And this is where, again, if you're just doing bike sessions and you're taking in a lot of carbohydrate liquids, you know, let's say Gatorade or Tailwind or any of these, you know, products which are high concentration carbohydrate, you probably will feel pretty good on the bike. You're probably not going to necessarily complain that much. Some people will, some people won't. However, if you take in that huge amount of liquid and then run off the bike, what happens? Most common complaint, I felt like I had all this stuff sloshing around inside my gut.
Stomach.
And then what happened? 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes in, I had to go to the toilet because that high concentration of carbohydrate reduces gastric emptying from the stomach. If, however, what you do is maybe modulate that, take in lower amounts of that carbohydrate liquid, I've definitely softened on athletes taking in some form of carbohydrate with liquid. It's not something that you have to completely eradicate. Maybe if you've got a lot of issues, remove it initially and then reintroduce it slowly. But certainly look at, you know, maybe it's 20 grams that you're getting through the liquid carbs, and then you're taking in gels. A lot of the gels these days, they're 30 grams of carbs. Start to think about that. You've only got to eat 3 gels every 20 minutes and you're taking in 90 grams of carbs, like an hour. You top that up with a couple of sips of a drink, which has maybe, let's say 30 grams in the bottle. You're drinking a bottle an hour. Okay, you're at 120 grams an hour straight up. And it was that easy. And then because you've taken in less liquid, you've just taken in a little lighter amount of liquid, which might have some electrolytes in it or predominantly water. You get off the bike, you're into the run, you're like, oh, wow, my gut doesn't feel terrible. I'm not sloshing around. And then I'm going to start, for a female, maybe 20, 25 minutes in, you have your first feed, depending if you're a man and depending on what you're trying to achieve, it might be 15 minutes into the run. You then have your first gel. On the runs, what products would we recommend? Gels. Use gels. On the run. Yeah,
not
absolutely.
Chews, or why?
Do you really want to be chewing something and running really fast?
Honestly, I feel like I spend the entire time of my race eating. I feel like I waste so much time eating, but I know it's important.
you're certainly not wasting time. I mean,
I'm teasing, but yeah.
No, but I mean, it's, I remember Sarah saying, and, you know, Sarah used to always get comments. They're like, she'd talk about it being like an eating competition as opposed to a triathlon.
Yeah.
You know, where she was smashing. Yeah. And we see this all the time, athletes. It's so funny because so many photos come through and they're just eating on the bike.
Eating.
It's managing calories. I think as much as anything, like a triathlon, or certainly an Ironman 70.3, there you're managing from a practical standpoint. How do you actually carry this type of fuel, and how do you actually get it into yourself on a regular basis in order to make sure that you're fueling appropriately? And, you know, we do a really cool thing that we do at Fuelin is that we do weekly Q&A sessions. So we do, you know, topics every week on, depending on what the athletes want, whether it's high carb fueling. Last week's was on actually the practicalities of carrying all the fuel, which was probably one of the best sessions we've ever had, because we had athletes like Lena Thames, who's a professional Danish athlete, share what she does on how her bike is set up. We had age group champions come on, Lindsay Foster, we had Pat Romano. We had these athletes who are either from professional to age group show how they set their bike up, and then what they do in T2 and how they manage their run, and how they actually go about, you know, consuming caffeine, electrolytes, carbohydrates, what products they're using. And it's fascinating to see how different
Can
athletes...
people watch that, or only if they're part of Fuelin?
We'll probably put that one up on our YouTube channel. We tend to put them out later. But it's fascinating to hear athletes share, you know, like one of the guys, he had, you know, because bottles often come out, you know, when you hit a bump and things like that. So he uses like a female, what are the little elastic bands? So he puts those, he loops that over, a hairband. He loops that across the nozzle of his bottles in the back of his gorilla cage, which is easy to flick on and off as he grabs the bottle, but it ensures that they never come out. Now, he's an engineer. I was going
to say, that's so smart. Yeah.
It's brilliant. Who else? Lena Thames, so she uses precision hydration. They don't have any sodium, and the caffeine amount in there isn't as much as, I don't think they've got a caffeinated gel. Maybe they do. But anyway, I tend to recommend 200 milligrams of caffeine.
I think they just introduced. Yeah.
So I tend to recommend 200 milligrams of caffeine as a bolus, because that, you know, in science has been shown to be more effective than a smaller dose. What she does is put a very, very small slit in the top of her precision gel, and then slides the 200 milligram caffeine tablet into that. She tapes that to the bike. She knows that's the caffeinated gel. She knows exactly, based on what we've talked about, when to take that gel. And so it's just clockwork, and it's all about, she practices that as well. And it's just about being
you have to
really systematic about the way you approach this nutrition, because we can talk about the science. We can talk about, oh, okay, you want 90 grams an hour, you want 120 grams an hour. But if you don't actually practice it and you don't understand the practicalities of it, it's all just theory, and therefore it's useless. It depends. It depends on it depends on how big the difference between sweat rate testing and then this sweat sodium concentration. And I think overall what we're seeing, so do I believe in sweat rate testing? Absolutely. I think it's really important for athletes to get an understanding of how much body weight they're losing when performing exercise, whether that's on the bike or on the run, and at differing intensities. So, and certainly at race intensity, you want to have a good understanding of what it is as a mark in the sand of your average sweat rate. Now, it's not going to be a definitive marker. It's not going to be like, right, I lose 1 liter per hour every single time. It's probably going to be a range whereby you might be losing something like 0.8 to 1.1 liters per hour. But what that allows you to do is manage your, you know, in session, so whether that's training or whether your race day, hydration appropriately. And I think that's really important to understand whether you've got a very high sweat rate or whether it's a moderate or whether it's very low, because I think, again, what we're seeing is, unfortunately, we see and there's far more danger in over consuming fluids than under consuming fluids, is that because of this notion of I need to drink every aid station, or it's drilled into athletes that they need to be, hydrated at all times, there is this risk of overconsumption of fluid, of hyponatremia, which is potentially life-threatening. And so I think, as a starting point, you certainly as an athlete want to understand how much fluid are you losing per hour, and then appropriately managing that, and appropriately managing your percentage of body weight lost. And how do you do that? You weigh yourself before a session, you weigh yourself after, you record the amount of fluids that you consume during that, and then you plug it into a calculator, and it will give you percentage of body weight lost. We do that again within the Fuelin app. We provide all that.
I was just going to say, like, within your app, like, so for my listeners who, are like, wow, this is so awesome, and I really want to try to do all these things and really dial into my hydration and my nutrition, and overall, like, match that with their training and their coaching and their performance. Like, it would just be easy if they sign up for Fuelin, because it would take a lot of the guesswork out. It would take a lot of the guesswork out. I mean, and it looks like, you have a lot of different options for athletes on your program and your platform, from one-on-one, like custom. Talk to me a little bit about the programs that you offer to athletes that want to sign up for Fuelin.
Yeah, so and thank you. It's very being Australian, we don't tend to sort of sell ourselves very well, and so the whole tall poppy syndrome, where you get cut down if you do too much of that. So it's nice to hear someone be very complimentary about the program. But look, we have 3 different tiers. We have one-on-one, which is certainly there's a cost involved with that, whereby it is $500 a month to work one-on-one with either myself or Elizabeth Infant. That's generally for people who really want to understand, at a fairly high level, sort of a fairly, intricate level of understanding their health and how to improve their performance. And so that's not for everyone. We then have another tier, which is what we call a co-pilot, which still allows coaching from myself and Elizabeth, with reviews of things like blood tests, metabolic cart, day-to-day nutrition, supplements, everything like that. And that's more focused around the community in terms of a group training, and understanding that coaching method. And then you have what we call autopilot, which, again, as I think I was explaining to you, for $25 a week, which if we break it down to lattes, is probably a latte a day. And, ultimately, if you remove the latte from your life every day, you probably are on the journey for potentially improving body composition in its own right. So, for $25 a week, you get this synchronized training plan, nutrition plan, which synchronizes with Training Peaks Today's Plan or Final Search. It will provide you with, your pre-session fueling, your post-session fueling, and your in-session fueling, along with the sweat rate calculator and the ability to understand your sweat rate and how to manage your hydration appropriately, your carb capacity sort of calculator, and learning from an individual basis how much carbohydrates you can cope with and how to improve that. And then all the athletes get this, the access to this weekly Q&A session with either Elizabeth or myself, which I think is a major value, a major selling point, if we want to call it that, in terms of just upskilling and educating everyone on the program with, the ability to ask us questions on a weekly basis, whether you are in the autopilot or whether you're in the one-to-one. You then have access to sort of learn about the latest and greatest in, performance and nutrition on a weekly basis, which is really lovely.
You also have recipes for people that's really a great perk of the platform.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that I always think, the recipes, I love cooking. And so, the recipes, I think we've got over 700 recipes within the app, and they're all color coded. So they're going to be either in the red, which is, again, the lower amounts of carbohydrate, the yellow, which is the moderate, and then the green, which is the higher amounts of carbohydrate and probably more geared towards fueling for racing and high intensity training and training sessions.
All right.
And
And
the
are
athletes,
most,
the
yeah.
athletes can just, the way it works is you'll be given a color for, before or post training. You just click on the cell, it brings up, hundreds of different options that you can choose from. And then you can use those either as inspiration and use those to inspire you to then, put in your own sort of flair and enter that into, say, Lose It or MyFitnessPal, if that's what you're doing for tracking. Or you can just, consume the meal that we recommend, tick it off, and that will subtract from the macros on the day as well. So, you have multiple ways of looking at your nutrition and your diet, because I think one thing, when I did create the program, I was very reluctant on telling you, Marnie, like, okay, I need you to eat 2 eggs on a Monday. I need you to eat a lasagna on a Wednesday, and I need you to eat, chicken and rice on a Friday, when I can't tell you that, A, because I don't know what's in your fridge, and B,
Yeah.
I don't know what your training is going to be on that particular day. Whereas if we can actually sync with your training program and then provide you with a framework around the principles of fueling correctly, then you as the athlete are empowered to actually make decisions and get an understanding of what your body needs and what foods you tolerate and cope with the best. And I think that's a really powerful sort of paradigm to be in, whereby, you as the athlete are in charge of what goes into your body. I'm just giving you the principles of how much you need and providing you with examples of options that you can choose. And then depending if you feel like chicken, beef, tofu, or whatnot, you can then make that meal based around what you actually prefer to eat. And I think that's a super way of thinking about nutrition, as opposed to being really prescriptive and saying you need this particular food at this particular time of day.
And now, are most of your athletes triathletes that are on the program, or all of them triathletes?
They're not all triathletes. We have Ironman and triathlete, I guess, is the predominant, athlete population we have on there. We have cyclists, and then we have quite a few mountain bike athletes as well.
Interesting.
So the mountain biking seems to be very popular at the moment. And what's really interesting is that they're also coming on trying to understand how to fuel their performance as well, because they're probably chronically underfueling. And that's a different, we go back to what we were saying about the difference between a triathlete and, say, a mountain biker or a cyclist, is that the cyclist gets to stay on the bike the entire time.
Right.
So their choice of fuel can actually be different from what the triathlete chooses. And now we can go potentially to actually using a liquid carbohydrate, because, again, coming down to the safety of the mountain biker, they've probably got a Camelback on. They don't want to take their hands off the handlebars. So the predominant fuel source is probably going to be a liquid carbohydrate, and they're going to cope with that very, very well.
And runners, I mean, they're just starting to use nutrition on their races.
Well,
I love runners.
Okay.
I'm a runner first, but yeah.
Well, there you go. And that's the other group that have really started to pick up is marathon runners. People who are doing half marathons and marathons are now reaching out to us saying, how can I improve my marathon? And, I had one of our longstanding athletes who's been actually on the program for just over 2 years, because he just loves, he's a CEO of a very high powered company, but he just loves the simplicity of looking at his daily plan, because he's got a hell of a lot going on in his life. And he's like, oh, okay, it's a red meal. Fine. I know that I've got to eat salad with a lean source of protein. That's what I'm eating today. Oh, it's a green meal. Okay, I can go nuts. I can have some rice. I can have some pasta. Or I can have sweet potato, and get my total amounts of carbs up. He just wants to see a color, and then he knows what type of meal he's going to be having. But he was explaining on the weekend, he did a half marathon, and he did it with some friends, and he had to just really drill it into them to maybe consume some gels, during the run, to actually get them to feel really good. And now they didn't take in nearly as much as him. Now he came third, I think, in his age group.
Right.
You know, he smashed it out of the park. They didn't do quite as well, but they sort of were like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I didn't think you needed to take in any carbohydrates when running. And I'm like, that makes no sense at all. Why? You're still running really fast. You're trying to perform at your best. What do we know? We know that carbohydrates are going to enable you to run faster and further if you take them on board and you've got prolonged like exercise. So it's like,
it's really funny though, how like there's like just different personalities within each sport based on like where the origins are, right? Like, so
sure.
I think runners, it was like this fringe culture back in the 70s when like the first running boom happened. So, you know, people who are like serious runners historically would not be taking in any nutrition, but the times have changed. I mean, everything has changed, but yeah, I mean.
And I think you've got to move with the times. And it's like, again, I'm not saying everyone needs to go out there who's running an hour and take gels.
Not an hour.
But there's going to be, you know, if your half marathon time is what, 1:30, something like that, 1:30, 1:40.
Right.
If you want to try and bring the time down, then there is going to be a notion for practicing with some higher carbohydrate fueling during the training sessions that require it on maybe the weekend to actually practice tolerating those carbohydrates, improving absorption, improving gastric emptying, and then allowing you to go really, really fast.
Right.
And
so,
like, you know, and so I think there's this badge of honor for runners to say, oh no, I did a marathon without eating anything. And it's like, good on you. You probably could have gone so much faster if you actually took on somewhere between 60 and 90 grams an hour during that marathon. You probably would have smashed it out of the park.
I mean, I have to say that like before I did triathlon, I was a runner. And when I started doing triathlon and I was, you know, learning about nutrition, I was like, wait, you mean I'm going to be eating the whole time, like even running? But it really is game changing. And I think, you know, it's true, the times are changing. But and how do you work with athletes who have like food allergies? I know you said you worked with someone, your first athlete had Hashimoto's, an autoimmune disease. So obviously I'm sure you're sensitive to those things within Fuelin.
Yeah, so I mean, when you first sign on, obviously we ask about you know, known allergies and then potential intolerances, and then the meals are filtered to remove. You know, if you're allergic to gluten, say my mother's a celiac, you know, if she would not be presented with any meals that contain gluten in them. So you have, therefore, the range of recipes to avoid certain food types or certain ingredients.
And then also like the same thing with plant-based athletes.
Yeah, so we have vegans, vegetarians, pescatarians, and it's just the dietary preference that they prefer. I think the important thing, no matter what that dietary preference is, and again, we see this quite a lot, is, you know, just because you're a vegetarian or a vegan doesn't mean that you're necessarily healthy. You know, if you think of a vegetarian or a vegan, you can still eat pizza, you can still eat pasta, you can eat bread because they're non-animal products. But is that going to result in you being a really healthy individual? No.
Yeah.
Because ultimately taking in either ultra processed or processed foods in a high quantity, which isn't going to do you any good, regardless if you're eating animal products or not. So looking at the quality of your diet is really important. And that's something we emphasize a lot, like whether you're a pescatarian, a vegan, a vegetarian, or an omnivore, you know, something that we will push on a daily basis is a huge amount of vegetables, you know, leafy salads, vegetables for the individual athletes to take in, because it's something that we know historically is very, very low in consumption throughout the Western world. And if you look at the percentages of people who actually get in sort of their 5 or 6 serves of vegetables, it's incredibly low. We're talking single digit percentages. Which, you know, people are missing out on their fiber intake. You know, you should be aiming for around 30 grams of fiber per day. Keeping in mind what we said before, obviously, if you've got, you know, big training session of high intensity or a race, you want to be reducing that fiber intake in those days leading up. But on a daily basis, aiming for 30 grams of fiber a day, so important for just overall health in terms of, you know, everyone will talk about the gut microbiome. What does the bacteria in your gut feed on? It feeds on fiber. feeds on insoluble fiber or on soluble fiber. How do you get that fiber into you? Eat vegetables, eat fruit. Fruit is not, again, like think about fruit. Like I can't tell you how many times people will say to me, oh, should I eat fruit? It's like, hell yeah, you should eat fruit.
More like maybe like along the lines of business, are you partnering with, I know you work with Matt Dixon and Purple Patch. Do you team up and partner with a lot of big triathlon clubs, or are you looking to do that with your business? Is that something that you do?
So we have, the way we work is we have some dedicated partnerships with teams like Purple Patch, with Toro Performance, with Malna Performance, Valiant Endurance. We have some particular, and T0 is a team based in Australia. We have particular partnerships with those. What we also do is work with a lot of coaches, so single coaches teams, single coach teams. So there are plenty of coaches out there who work by themselves, but work with a lot of athletes. So we certainly work with a lot of those types of coaches, and then we work with teams with maybe 1 to 5 coaches. Now, the beautiful thing about the program is what we're not trying to do is replace that coach. We're just trying to assist them and actually allow them to focus on coaching the athlete in terms of the exercise component, and allow us to assist them by providing a very detailed and, evidence-informed or evidence-based nutrition program to assist their athlete in being able to achieve or perform in whatever the coach is actually setting out. So rather than being combative, what we would say is, let's work together here, and let's actually, it takes a village, doesn't it? So, if you can have that mindset and go, okay, so we're not going to charge the coach anything to work with their athletes. Like, the athlete gets the benefit of having nutrition experts in their corner, their fantastic coach in their corner, and then potentially anyone else in their corner that actually, you're then working along like a professional sporting model where, having worked in professional sports for many, many years, the reason professional athletes do so well is because they have multiple disciplines surrounding them, each in their expertise, that allows that athlete to benefit from that knowledge.
Yeah. But I could just see it being such like an organic fit for your team to team up with
Golden Gate Triathlon Club actually reached out to us, and we've just signed, we're just going to do a partnership with them, with their actual team, rather than a coach per se, actually with the team, and helping them, their athletes understand, come onto the program, and then provide them again with Q&A sessions and education, and actually helping. And we haven't done that before. So we've only ever worked with coaching teams as opposed to triathlon clubs, which I think is a really interesting concept, and hopefully one that works really well and provides, the managers of these teams with, really up-to-date information that they can relay to their athletes, but also allow us to talk to their athletes directly and hopefully educate them.
Yeah. And I heard you say something about blood work. Where do you get your blood work for Fuelin? Like, how do you get your athletes? Like, where do you do that?
So we use Inside Tracker to visualize what's happening in terms of trends. So I think Inside Tracker's platform is fantastic for being able to visualize what's happening with an athlete over the course of time. We have at Fuelin, we have a set sort of panel that we request the athletes go and get. Now they can either get that through Inside Tracker if they want to do it that way, or they can see their regular doctor, get the blood drawn, and then upload the results into Inside Tracker. It's just a really good system, I think, from being able to visualize and sit down with it, over a video call, and actually show them what is happening and what the trends over time look like. In terms of the nutritional recommendations, they have nutritional recommendations in there. We also, use our expertise to guide the athlete with what we're recommending from a food and from a supplementational standpoint, based around that. But it's a fantastic system. I think they've done a really good job at the UI and the UX of it, and how it works and how simple it can be.
Yeah. And what are some of the like when you are looking at athletes, do you have like certain biomarkers that are your like top priority that people are keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think you can break it down into health and then performance. I think from a health perspective, certainly for an endurance athlete, you want to be looking at your iron status. So ferritin and hemoglobin are probably two of the most important. You throw in TIBC, and transferrin saturation and hematocrit to look at, their overall iron status. I think that's really important. We know that there's a high percentage of endurance athletes, females greater than males, that are probably iron deficient, anemic, or certainly have low. And I mean, vitamin D status is very important for athletes, from, bone, muscle, tendon, particularly that's something that we would look at with the endurance athletes. I think from a health perspective, looking at blood glucose, HbA1c is really important as well. Just understanding where does that sit in terms of health parameters, lipid profile, that being cholesterol. I think all those markers are very important. And again, the differentiation between health and performance and how they interact, I think, is important to explain to an athlete and then work on strategies to improve those. And often it's not, drastic changes you need to make. It's often just simple things that you're changing within the day-to-day diet that can have a significant impact on those blood markers.
And what about you? What are you doing to stay fit and healthy? I mean, you're over here helping everyone else get fit and healthy.
Yeah, I tend to, I run. I've sort of backed off my running, although I think I'll get back into it. And I think we just, COVID has been, as everyone's had, it sort of threw a lot of spanners in the works, didn't it? And sort of derailed a lot of training. So back in the gym, I'm actually sort of back in a period of heavy lifting, sort of 4 or 5 days a week, and just trying to get rid of the dad bod. And running and doing that. It's temperature's starting to warm up here in Australia, so I'll get back out and start surfing again, which will be fun.